Pacers finalize their roster for the season. They waive Cole Swider. They don't bring in a 15th player. They don't extend Isaiah Jackson. What does that mean for this year? What does that all mean for next year? Why does Johnny Furphy play into this equation quite a bit? Plus, let's talk about some Pistons ahead of the Pacers' first game on today's Locked On Pacers podcast.
You are Locked On Pacers, your daily Indiana Pacers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What up, y'all? Happy Tuesday and happy start of the NBA season, and welcome into another edition of the Locked On Pacers podcast, where we, of course, talk about the Indiana Pacers. As always, my name is Tony East. I cover the team for Forbes and SI, and today we have to talk about the Pacers roster moves. It's finalized. I waited till Monday to see what happened with Isaiah Jackson, as predicted. Even though I was wrong about my first extension prediction, this time I was right. No extension for Isaiah Jackson. We'll talk about why. We'll talk about the Swider waiver and the lack of follow-up move, which is actually not really a lack of move. It does portend potentially a future of moves. Portend maybe a little bit too ominous of a word there. So we have lots of roster stuff to discuss, plus how Johnny Furphy's absence kind of played in to all of it. And then we'll talk some Pistons. Pacers play the Pistons tomorrow to kick off their season. Speaking of tomorrow, Rhett Bauer and I already recorded it. Our season preview, second year in a row with him, maybe third. I can't even remember. Breaking down all sorts of Pacers topics. That will be out tomorrow for game day. Got my W sweatshirt on. This is my first time recording since the WNBA finals ended. What a game 5. Crappy regulation ending, but awesome game. Awesome finals. Awesome season. Now it's time for the Pacers in the NBA. And speaking of the Pacers, last week after their final preseason game, the day after we learn, Cole Swider waived. And if you remember the discussion about the roster battle, Rick Carlisle did say it was possible that nobody got the 15th spot on the team. Kendall Brown didn't get it. Cole Swider didn't get it. I thought he played well enough to at least stick for a bit, even though I totally understand waiving him, and I'll explain why in a second. Rick Carlisle did say that decision was like splitting hairs. It was so close. Swider already has signed a 2-way contract with the Pistons, so he'll be on the floor opening night for the Pacers season opener, just not with the Pacers. That opened up spot number 15 on the roster. So let's start with the Swider waiver itself, and then the 15th roster spot we'll get to. So Swider was completely non-guaranteed deal, could not be converted to a 2-way because it was not an Exhibit 10, and they don't even have a 2-way spot right now. Nobody got converted in his place. So what I thought and said a lot during the preseason about him was, I would rather, if I'm the Pacers, have, especially now that they are winning is the goal, have the 15th spot go to a clear specialist, someone who clearly has a role that can help the team. And he had one really, really rough shooting night in the preseason where Swider was 1 for 8, but the rest of them were pretty solid. The first and last games ended with double-digit scoring performances. You can clearly see, where the shooting comes from with him. And I thought that would have been enough for him to possibly stick around. Obviously, some defensive limitations, not the fastest player at all, but if you can shoot, there are at least some specialty ways you can be used. The Pacers, though, opted to waive him. They did not decide to keep him. They didn't want him. They'd rather have the flexibility. So let me first say this. Someone mentioned this to me, who's, let's say, around the league, and I thought this was a good point, that what does the theory of Johnny Furphy, what does Cole Swider do that you don't think Johnny Furphy could ever do, right? And now there's a chance Johnny Furphy is not ready to play at all and is not any good this season. He's a rookie second-round pick. But the theory of him being a shooting, taller wing is what Cole Swider kind of is. And so Furphy didn't play in the preseason. I actually want to talk more about that later. But in theory, any minutes that you'd say, oh, let's try Cole Swider here, maybe you just try Furphy anyway if you're the Pacers. And so that was a good point. From a position and skill set perspective. Obviously, Furphy could change what he is. I've been watching him in practice shoot recently. It's been cool to see him work on his footwork. I think that's been very telling. I'm getting a good feel for his shot and form and when it's going to drop just based on his footwork in these practice sessions. But anyway, with Swider specifically, he didn't expand his game enough beyond that or show enough consistency to really say, yes, obviously, instead of Furphy and obviously instead of anyone else, this is the guy they would put out there for some sort of specialty moment or in garbage time. And this will have a long-term value, right? Or at least clearly in this season, this can help them win in some way because it's a 1-year deal, non-guaranteed. And he could have been restricted after the season, but they would have had to negotiate a new deal, right? It was only a 1-year pact. So he would have had to maybe impressed a little more than he did to actually stick around. I think it was close. It was good enough that he got another spot somewhere else, which is nice. But I suppose it's not that stunning that it did go this way. And that put the Pacers roster at 14 with their 3 2A guys. Now, a lot of the discussion with the roster battle, some of this because I talked about it, some of this because Rick Carlisle said it straight up, was about Enrique Freeman and specifically 2A guys, but we all saw who played the best of the 2A guys by far, and that was Enrique Freeman. And the reason he got brought up a lot playing well is because Rick Carlisle said, yeah, with our 15th roster spot, he mentioned the 2A guys, Enrique Freeman being one of them and clearly the best one. And if you go back in time, I've mentioned this a million times, so a lot of you already know what I'm going to say. They signed Tristan Newton and Quentin Jackson to a 2A on the same day and then signed Freeman like 2 or 3 weeks later. And Swider was signed in between those moves. And so I am just guessing a little bit here, but it seems kind of clear by that string of transactions to me that they were considering, after a really good summer league from Freeman and meh to good summer leagues from Jackson and Newton, mostly meh, that Freeman could get their 15th spot then or a 2-way. Once they didn't have a spot to offer, they gave him the 2-way. And so the thought during the preseason was similar to me of, oh, maybe they want to give him the 15th spot instead of Cole Swider, and they could give him a 3 or 4 year deal by converting him, and that has more long-term upside than, a 1-year deal non-guaranteed for Swider. But I have to always say this, and people are finally, I think, catching up to what 2-way contracts really are. Enrique Freeman is on a 2-way deal. So if you convert him, like, sure, maybe you get some long-term flexibility, but you could do that during the season, and he's on a 2-way. He could play for the Pacers right now. Like in Detroit, the Pacers could say, Enrique, you're the backup 5. Go play. He's on the team. He has a contract. A 2-way is a Pacers contract. So yes, historically and likely going forward, he will spend a lot of time in the G League, but it doesn't mean that he's not on the Pacers. It doesn't have to be converted for him to play with the team. So what they've done by cutting Swider and not converting anybody, including Freeman, which maybe they could do later in the season, as they did with Terry Taylor and Dwayne Washington and Kendall Brown and Alex Poitras and Ben Moore and Edmund Sumner. And I'm sure I'm forgetting some guys who went from 2-way to standard deal with the Pacers. But midseason, even Terry Taylor, Dwayne Washington, Kendall Brown in just the last 2 seasons, right? If he plays well, he could get the promotion, especially as the Pacers assess their, one, they have a roster spot for the whole season now, but 2, Wiseman and James Johnson are not fully guaranteed deals either, right? So there's a lot of assessments still to go. Either way, by waiving Swider, they are now $2.5-ish million from the tax. And the flip side of that is they have $2.46 million in incentives, potential incentives on their team that could be paid out this year. So as of right now, perfect. Even if every incentive hits, there's no way they would end up hitting the tax this season, if that's a line they're trying to avoid. 1.5 million of those incentives are for Myles Turner, 400,000 to TJ McConnell, 560,000 for Obi Toppin. I know what they are, but it's really hard to get incentives, and I don't want to regurgitate something false. I'm not going to say what I believe them to be. I think the Pacers could figure out pretty quick into the season on about $1 million of it, in terms of the possibility of it being able to be hit as an incentive this season. Once they're fully certain, they could opt to give that 15th spot to somebody. Enrique Freeman's minimum is very cheap as a 0 years of service player. If they wanted to convert him, they could sign someone else completely. They have an open roster spot, right? Any player that they want or need could be available to them. But the longer they go without signing somebody, that more that distance from the tax could be relevant later in the season. And they have not used any of their mid-level exception yet, right? So they could offer even a 3-year deal to somebody they just signed tomorrow that they didn't draft. So they still have flexible options. I think people use the word flexibility incorrectly when it comes to roster spots in particular. People say, oh, they waived Cole Swider. They have flexibility now. They have financial flexibility because they've created a gap between their total roster spend and the tax line. But they didn't really create any roster flexibility because if they wanted to sign someone during the season with a roster spot, they could have just waived Cole Swider then. That could have happened at any time, right? So that was not in particular a flexibility changing thing, but there is financial flexibility created. Potentially, the longer they don't have someone on their team with a 15th slot, the more they could potentially spend on someone when they are really clear about their financial situation come, let's say, the 10-day contract timing, right? Because at that point of the season, they'll know a couple things. They'll know the likelihood of some of their key incentives. They will know if they're keeping Wiseman and Johnson and guaranteeing their contracts for the rest of the season. And they'll potentially know what they would need from that 15th spot or not need, which is even more relevant. If they don't need anything, that would make it more likely to promote a two-way guy. And so if you think Freeman right now should have a contract, I would say let's chat in January, because that is when the contract guarantee deadline is and teams really sort some stuff out. The Pacers could opt to promote him then. They could wait till March 5th, like last year, because that's the last day two-way contracts can be converted or signed. Excuse me, that's the last day two-way contracts can be signed, so then convert them then and then backfill it. So there's a couple deadlines to make that possible, but he's on the Pacers. So if you think this is an Enrique Freeman discussion, well, he could still be on the team at some point this season. He could still play in games. And if he continues to play well, the Pacers, as they have done basically every year with good two-way players, could certainly reward him and figure out the rest of their situation. Maybe it's a post-trade deadline thing, but just continue to keep an eye on Freeman. And if the Pacers have a need, they have an opening, and now more comfort from the tax to potentially bring someone in should they decide to do that. That is where the Pacers roster stands after the Swider waiver. And yet, that is not the only big roster news that we got. Isaiah Jackson, no extension on his rookie scale deal. So much to discuss with that, what that means, and the center situation for the Pacers, their next year spending, all coming up. But before we get to that, we need to talk about the great folks over at FanDuel. NFL fans, what a week. You can keep up with the season with a big return yourself over on FanDuel. They are America's #1 sportsbook. So when it happens to you, it happens to everybody. You get a hunch in the middle of whatever game you're watching. Well, you can check out the latest stats so you see who's doing well or what's going on in the game. You can view live play-by-play so you can know what's going on or what's coming up, and so much more, all on the same page where you place your bets right on FanDuel, so you can know the timing, the important people, and so much more to act on your hunches appropriately. And on top of that, when you place your first $5 bet on FanDuel, they'll get you started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Just a $5 bet to make that happen. That is all on FanDuel.com. And we're back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. Your second listen. So many teams signed guys to rookie scale extensions. Hop over there to hear about their roster outlook now before the season starts. Trey Murphy in New Orleans, Alperen Şengün and Jalen Green in Houston, Jalen Suggs in Orlando, Jaden Hardy in Dallas. I'm missing some that happened all over the league, but check out those out to hear more. Jalen Johnson in Atlanta, big one. I love that one for the Hawks, and plenty more for you to check out all over the network, the power of the network. And Jalen Suggs specifically is on Locked On Magic after he signed the deal. Awesome get for Philip Rossman-Reich and the network there to check that out. Also, there's a Locked On Pacers newsletter. I mentioned this yesterday. The link is on the Locked On Pacers Twitter feed if you want to hear more about that. It's awesome. It's the best way to get up-to-the-minute Pacers info, not even just from this podcast, plenty more from the NBA and from other Pacers sources there. Okay, let's keep going. Isaiah Jackson was eligible for an extension up till Monday at 6 p.m. It was a rookie scale extension, like Nesmith got the year before when he got his 3 years, $33 million, or Tyrese Haliburton when he got his 5-year max deal. Jackson was eligible for anywhere from 1 to 5 years and anywhere from the minimum up to $224 total million, unless he got escalators, which he wouldn't have. There's no point discussing that part of it. What there is points of discussing is what would or would not have made sense, right? Because the Pacers spending next year is pretty high. They might have to make some decisions if they want to deduct the tax. We don't know that next year. A lot will be decided on the court, but their finances are getting tight. They have to be more considering of what they spend money on and how much. And with Jackson, things were interesting, right? The original, if you listened to my extension preview off-season episode, one of the original contracts I brought up with him was Paul Reed. 2 years ago with the Sixers, he signed a 3-year, $23.5 million deal. But the last 2 years that were fully non-guaranteed with really strange ways that they become guaranteed based on the team he's on winning a playoff round. And that's a strange guarantee structure. It was actually an offer sheet with the Jazz and blah, blah, blah. But I wouldn't take that kind of low guarantee if I'm Isaiah Jackson. But that close to years or funkiness with dollars on the back end could have been something that made sense. You know, Goga Bitadze got $8 million. Drummond got $5 million. Franz Wagner was just over 10. You know, the rough, good backup center market is the mid to high single digits of the millions, right? And so if I'm Isaiah Jackson, I'd be looking at about that range. Well, guess what? His qualifying offer next year, should the Pacers make him a restricted free agent, is $6.4 million, right? So if you're Isaiah Jackson, why would you? I mean, maybe there's reasons to, if you can secure long-term money, that's great. But if they're offering you less than that and you think you're going to have a good enough year to at least be a restricted free agent, you'd probably not take it. So 3 years all at flat salary starting at his qualifying offer for Isaiah Jackson would have been $19.2 million. I thought maybe that could be where it ends up with some light guarantees in the back. 3 years starting at that number with max raises is $20.8 million. Maybe it could have been something like that. I don't even know why it had to be 3 years, but that's just typically the lowest you see for rookie extensions. Jalen Green, an exception that we saw on Monday. So that was kind of the numbers to watch. That 6.4 really matters. Anything below that, he could just say, "Oh, wait, I know I can probably get that if I have a decent season." And instead, nothing. Nothing makes the most sense to me as an outcome. But those are, and I bring up the Paul Reed numbers and those numbers because they're kind of close. I bet that was the range they were roughly negotiating around. Any more than that would have been kind of surprising to me. What's the point of tripping all over yourself to do that if you're the Pacers? And you have rights next year. If he's good, he'll be restricted and they can try to keep him then. So they had to keep their own upside in mind, especially because of their next year spending situation, right? So for the Pacers, after they did something last week that I don't know if we've talked about, they officially picked up the team options in the contract of Ben Mathurin, Jarris Walker, and Ben Shepherd for 2025-26. We did discuss that being a thing they would have to do, but it's a no-brainer. They were going to do it. So now the Pacers, after that, and with no extension for Jackson, I have at least $165 million in salaries for them, guaranteed for next season already, for 2025-26. That is $11 million over the salary cap, and the luxury tax line next year is about $188 million, assuming the cap grows in the way that most people think it does, right? So that leaves the Pacers $22 million from that tax line with 10 players. And if you add in their first round pick, depending on where that is, that's actually below $20 million from the tax line with 11 players. So they have to fill out 4 spots, potentially 3 of those spots all being centers, with Turner, Jackson, and potentially Wiseman as free agents. And it'd be really hard to keep Myles Turner in center of the tax. So if they agreed to terms with Isaiah Jackson and the deal didn't give the Pacers some sort of value either at the front or the back end, it wasn't worth it to them because it sacrifices very important financial wiggle room that they actually need next season, right? I didn't think TJ McConnell would get extended. I wasn't like saying it was impossible. I said 49% no. So I barely leaned no. Excuse me, I said 49% yes. So I barely leaned no. And then it did happen. But I think a lot of the reason it did happen, and I would have done this as the Pacers had I known this was a possibility, is yes, he got 4 years, $45 million. McConnell did. He added money on 25-26 that wasn't previously there. But the last 2 years are only $10 million guaranteed combined. And that second year's a team option. So really nothing guaranteed. They're only $26.2 million guaranteed in total. That total being so low means that you're willing to pay up front to have him, knowing how much flexibility you get at the back as the Pacers, right? You can get out of that if things go sideways, and he's good now, right? That's why I said when I was talking about Isaiah Jackson's possibilities, given his contract structure, I said, hey, if they could get lighter guarantees in the back, maybe this is more possible, similar to Paul Reed, but that didn't happen. Well, no extension happened. I guess I don't know what the negotiations were, but that is not the case, obviously. And so if that's not going to happen, that makes it not worth it for the Pacers to sacrifice some of their necessary spending next year. Perhaps they could circle back to this, right? Who knows where this could go or should go. It will all be decided on the court. And I think that's how it should be, right? If Turner plays really well, they'll have to make decisions to keep him. If Jackson plays really well, they should have to make decisions to keep him. That's what the point of games are. Play well, and you get paid as a player who played well. Same with James Wiseman, potentially, right? So the court will decide how the center stuff is shaken out, but that's the Pacers' financial situation for next year, and that's Isaiah Jackson's outlook. No extension. That was my guess. That is what happened. We don't know how negotiations went necessarily, but now the Pacers have 4 expiring contracts potentially next season, and it would be Myles Turner, Isaiah Jackson, James Johnson, and James Wiseman, front court players galore. So much more to get to on the roster front as the season progresses, but can you believe this? With Isaiah Jackson's deadline in the past, I tweeted this because it's so remarkable to me. Myles Turner extended in January of 2023, right? And from leading up to that, there was a lot of chatter about his extension. I wrote a whole article about a renegotiation extension. And then what happened, right? Like it was a thing being talked about. And since then, there's been so many players on the Pacers who either got extensions or were eligible that were very, very frequently discussed. Tyrese Haliburton, obviously, Buddy Hield, Aaron Nesmith, who got one, Andrew Nembhard, who got one, Isaiah Jackson, TJ McConnell, who got one, Obi Toppin last summer, right? All those players at different times and all that. Now, for a while, calm. No one on the Pacers is extension eligible now until next July when Ben Mathurin becomes extension eligible. So there is no contract talk to come this season on that front. The only discussions will be about the trade deadline with Turner's contract, certainly, and all that stuff we talked about earlier with Freeman and the guarantees in early January as well. Everything else is pretty static for the Pacers until next summer, and maybe in a good way for a team trying to really figure out what their roster is and what their future should be. So as I expected, no extension for Jackson. I expected no extension for McConnell and was wrong, though, so don't always listen to me. I just say my opinion based on the numbers that I have. And now the Pacers proceed. Their team is done. They have their 17 for the year. They can, if they want, add an 18th. They could make some moves, and it will all be decided as it should. Who gets paid, who plays, all that on the court. They've set it up perfectly for that to be the case. Rick Carlisle loves the earn-it structure, and they've literally set it up with their contracts for that to be their future. I want to touch on Johnny Furphy's preseason absence and then talk about the Pistons, the Pacers' first opponent tomorrow night, to close out this podcast. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Halloween lets us have fun with what scares us. But what about those fears that don't involve zombies and ghosts? Well, therapy can be a great tool for facing your fears and finding ways to overcome them, because sometimes the scariest thing is not facing our fears in the first place and holding ourselves back. Therapy can be helpful for so many things, including what I just said, but also learning positive coping skills, being the best version of yourself, setting boundaries. It is not just for people who have experienced major trauma. So if you have been thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. You just fill out a brief questionnaire, get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch at any time for no additional charge. So overcome your fears with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today, and you'll get 10% off your first month. How about that? That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. We are back here on Locked On Pacers. Thanks for making us your first listen today and every single day. Your second listen, couple Rex, Locked On Pistons with Kuka Hill. And then the teams that play tonight. NBA is back. There's 2 games tonight as the season tips off. And you should check out those Locked On shows to really dive into those teams. Get ready for the games. We're off and running. I can't believe it. Let's close this out with 2 things. One thing I wanted to hit on was Johnny Furphy specifically did not play in the preseason. And I already touched on a big factor of that and what it means wrinkled into Cole Swider, because Cole Swider was playing like 20 minutes a night in some of these games because they didn't have Furphy to play. But it would be nice. Wouldn't it be nice right now to have the information of Furphy and what he could be and what he looks like in an NBA setting, right? What kind of wiggle he has, what kind of shooting ability he has, his movement, his feel in the Pacers system. I don't think he'll play very much this year. Already the top 11 players are spoken for, really top 12 on the Pacers. But if Furphy is a mediumly good shooting wing at his size, like you'd at least sniff playing him in certain situations. And I don't think that will be the case this year, but not having that information, I think, is a big bummer, especially for a team that just kept the roster spot open largely with in mind, hey, there's a rookie we just drafted who could be playing at this guy's position in some of his role spots as the season progresses. I still think Furphy primarily will be playing with the Maddens, but last year at this time we had at least a decent feel for Jarris Walker in the NBA. We knew 2 years ago that Mathurin, hey, was pretty good. He can really handle the ball. We have no idea what the deal is with Furphy. Obviously the team does. They can watch him practice. They know what he can do, but we don't. And I think that's kind of a bummer for assessing what he could be, what his season could look like, how things could go for him. And it certainly maybe, that's not a real thing. It potentially was a factor in their roster decision, and it stinks for him. It stinks for evaluation to not know where he sits in the pecking order, how the team feels about him, what he looks like on an NBA court. And I think that is a big loss of preseason, not getting to see that. But hopefully by the time the season starts, he's good to go. Some blowouts, maybe he can get on the floor, get his first pro minutes. If the Pacers are in a blowout either direction early in the season, no idea about his health status. Hopefully we find out more on Tuesday. Speaking of their first games, Pacers open in Detroit want to talk about Detroit just for a second to close this one out, because we don't know about any team. No games have been played yet. We can make our assumptions based on last year and based on moves made, and I'm about to do exactly that. But the Pistons stunk last year. A rare team that the Pacers could sweep, which is funny because they swept some great teams, but the only awful team they swept, I believe, was the Pistons. They struggled with all the rest. And the Pistons just went into preseason and quietly were kind of good. And this backs up a small theory I have about the Pistons this season. They had a plus 8.4 net rating in the preseason. Asterisk, big one, in the preseason. I cannot stress this enough that we're talking about the preseason. 7th best net rating for the Detroit Pistons in the preseason. And that was largely because the Pacers were 9th, by the way. That is largely because their defense was excellent. The Pistons preseason defense was the 4th best in the NBA. Their offense was pretty bad. Their offense was 19th in the league and just a smidge off of being in the bottom 10, right? So they defended really well. JB Bickerstaff, new coach, unsurprising, but they're not as much of a joke, or at least they weren't in the preseason. And that's been my floating in my head Pistons theory recently. I already have liked Cade Cunningham. I have for a while. People who've watched him up close and with Team USA gush about him, say he's so good. The thing that I think about the Pistons, look, they added talent, and we'll get to those players in a second that will make this game just more difficult in general. They played last year so many not good NBA players, or players who were not effective last season. Maybe they'll grow into something more because a lot of them were young, but a lot of them are gone, right? Marvin Bagley, Troy Brown, no longer with the team. Tosan Evbuona, I hope I said that right. Malachi Flynn out of the league. Evan Fournier's out of the league. Danilo Gallinari's gone. Taj Gibson's gone. Joe Harris is gone. Killian Hayes is gone. Kevin Knox is gone. I believe Chimezie Metu's gone. I hope, now that I said that. Shake Milton's gone. He's still in the league, though. Mike Muscala, I believe, retired. He was actually pretty good, though. Stanley Amude, I believe, is out of league. He got a deal with he might have a 2-way with the Bucks. Either way, I just named a ton of guys who played like a decent amount of minutes for the Pistons last year and were not good, like negative NBA players. In fact, Killian Hayes, out of the league, played over 1,000 minutes for them this year, right? Like, it's unbelievable. Wiseman's gone. He's with the Pacers now. He played over 1,000 minutes for them last year. Kevin Knox played over 500 minutes for them last year. He's probably out of the league. Like, they gave a lot of minutes to players who were not very good. So strike that they added talent. Just forget about the new Pistons players for a second. We'll talk about them in just a moment. Just the fact that these players who were totally ineffective for the Pistons last year are gone, I think that alone has been my running theory of why they will be better. In fact, that was part of my theory on why the Fever will be better this year, even beyond Caitlin coming into the mix, was a lot of their players that were woefully ineffective 2 years ago were no longer with the team. And if you sort by advanced stats for the Pistons, they had some players that were really rough for them from an impact perspective in their minutes, and a lot of them are gone. Troy Brown and Joe Harris and Knox and Fournier and Boeheim and Hayes all had really terrible BPMs, right? And a lot of their other tough advanced stat guys were young and should be better. So my operating theory on the Pistons already is that better coach, Cade's great, and they got rid of a lot of the crap, will make them like competent and decent. And then they were kind of good in the preseason. And that shows what their additions can be, is that they added some offensive firepower that helps connect everything. Tim Hardaway among that group, Tobias Harris among that group, Malik Beasley above that group. Those guys are just competent. They can shoot, they can space. They're good NBA players. They're not exceptional NBA players, but they're good NBA players, right? They kept Fontecchio. They added Paul Reed. All of a sudden, they have some adults on this team who are capable, talented players, and they basically got them for like nothing using their cap space. So the Pistons, I don't think will be like great. I probably will predict them 30-ish wins. It seems like a big jump, but they won 14 last year, right? 16 more wins. Over double is a lot. But getting rid of your negatives as much as adding positives, I think is going to make them capable. I don't think the Pacers will sweep them this year. I still think the Pacers are better, to be clear. I will predict the Pacers to win on opening night. But this is their first opponent. Rick Carlisle was talking about how tough their defense looked at practice earlier on Monday. I don't think the Pistons are going to totally suck this year, and I think there'll be an interesting test for the Pacers on opening night. And a really tough guy to keep out of the lane and contain, and Cade Cunningham could be a perfect start for the Pacers defense. Slow him down. It makes everybody else's life on that team so much harder. And Tobias Harris, a big forward. Can they have an answer for that? Because Siakam helped a lot with that. So 2 nice tests early for them against a team that they, on paper, look like they're better than. We don't know. No one's played yet. But a team the Pacers look like they're better than, who I think is better than people are giving credit for, but still worse than the Pacers. What does this look like? What can we learn about the team? We'll find out. Kuka Hill can tell you more about Detroit over on Locked On Pistons, but that's my take on the Pacers opening night opponent. If you want opinions on the whole season tomorrow, Rhett Bauer and I have plenty of them. We already recorded it. Over under for the win total. We talk about breakout candidates and regression candidates and X factors and can the Pacers win the division and the in-season tournament. That's tomorrow's podcast. Today's, though, hope you enjoyed it. Lots of topics to get into. The roster is set. The Pistons are coming. The Pacers are really coming to the Pistons, and I can't wait. Hope you guys have enjoyed rocking with me this whole off season. Back tomorrow talking Pacers basketball ahead of their season with Rhett Bauer. Till then, everybody have a wonderful day.